Thank you, mate, really, for those very kind and warm words of introduction. I must say that being here amongst the South African Jewish community, I feel very much at home. Some of you may not know, but actually my daughter, who's here tonight, Michal, married a South African, someone from South Africa, or my Machatonim are South African, made Aliyah a long time ago. And I'm also of Litvak heritage, so there is that extended connection in that regard. And so when I am amongst South African Jews, I can really say that I feel as if I'm amongst family. And you also have given me the opportunity to visit with my grandchildren by coming to Ra'anana, all four of whom are here this evening, so this is a special pleasure and privilege for me to come together in this kind of, as I say, extended mishpacha. And let me begin, if I may, with the teachings moving back to my own parents for a moment, because here I'm speaking not just of Litvak heritage, but really of Moreshet Yehudit, of a Jewish heritage, and the fundamental values that give expression and that underpin that heritage. And it was my father, Zichrono Livracha, who taught me early on, while I was a young boy, before I understood the profundity of the message, when he would speak to me and then repeat the importance of tzedek, tzedek tirdof, of justice, justice shall you pursue. And as he would put it, this must be the Vishinam Tam Levanecha. This is that which you must teach unto your children. That tzedek, tzedek tirdof, as he put it, was equal to all the other commandments combined. And that the etymology of the word tzedek, one word in Hebrew requires at least 3 words in English to reflect its meaning of justice and charity and righteousness. But I have to say that it was my mother, Zichrono Livracha, when she would hear my father speak to me about the importance of tzedek, tzedek tirdof, who would say to me that if you want to pursue justice, then you have to understand, you have to feel the injustice about you. You have to go in and about your community and feel the injustice. And you have to combat that injustice. Otherwise, the pursuit of justice is a theoretical construct. Otherwise, it's just an abstract notion. You have to make the pursuit of justice as something anchored in the combating of injustice, in the combating of tzedek. And I suspect that it was the teaching of my parents that resulted in me getting involved, if I may put it, in the 2 great human rights struggles of the second half of the 20th century. And that is the struggle for Soviet Jewry and the struggle against apartheid. And there are a lot of parallels with respect to these struggles. But if one looks for a moment on the struggle for Soviet Jewry, I mean, one of the first things that comes to mind with regard to that struggle is really what the Soviet Jews themselves said about it, namely that Putza Tana, Tishanat Olam, that a small group will transform the world. You know, we're on the eve of the Shloshim of Arik Einstein. And he also spoke of something which became like the kind of national anthem of the Soviet Jewry movement. Ani vata nishaneh ha'olam. That we will be able to change the world. These are the kinds of inspirations that, while anchored in the Soviet Jewry struggle, really have a global resonance to it. And when one speaks also of Soviet Jewry, one recalls also the power of solidarity in a just cause. How Israel and the Jewish diaspora were united in case and cause at that time. And it was that sense of achdut, that coming together, that made the struggle so powerful and so compelling. My grandchildren were discussing with me, Parshat Bo, which speaks of Moshe and Aaron coming together. Prior to that, all the experiences of brothers, whether we talk of Ken and Hevel, whether we're talking about Yaakov and Esav, or whether Yitzchak, Ishmael, they were all really more adversaries than coming together in common cause. But Moshe and Aaron came together in common cause. And that is the power of when the Jewish people come together in common cause. And we saw that in Soviet Jewry. And we saw the transformative impact of the struggle for Soviet Jewry, not only on the Jews in the Soviet Union, not only on the Jews in the diaspora. When Elie Wiesel wrote his book back in 1965 on the Jews of silence, people felt that he was talking about the Jews of the Soviet Union. No, as he put it, I was talking about the Jews in the diaspora, for whom that wake-up call of Kutzak Tanat Shanei Ta'olam was so necessary. And it was the Soviet Jews themselves who gave the inspiration, which ignited the whole of world Jewry, and which together with Israel ended up having a transformative impact, not only on Israel, not only on the Jewish people, but indeed on our whole global configuration. One can almost trace the struggle for Soviet Jewry as leading to, if I may borrow a Marxist metaphor, to the withering away of the Soviet Union itself. Because that became really a centerpiece of the East-West struggle, whereas the struggle for Soviet Jewry at that time was seen to be on the right side of history for all of us. And then to move to the struggle against apartheid. And here too, one saw the power of solidarity in a just cause. And here too, one saw the manner in which people coming together can have such an impact. And here, and this brings me to the point of the convergence of the two, both with regard to the struggle for Soviet Jewry and with regard to the struggle against apartheid, political prisoners, in the sense of Sharansky in the former Soviet Union, Mandela in South Africa, became, if you will, a looking glass into the case and cause as a whole, became metaphors for the struggle for human rights, became really expressions of the importance of Pidyon Shvuim. And this takes one back really to our Jewish heritage, because the whole notion of Pidyon Shvuim, of the liberation of the captives, is really such an important mitzvah that it's regarded as a mitzvah rabbah, that it really allows you to transgress the Sabbath for purposes of liberating political prisoners. And I want to now bring together those two struggles, because as it happened in my case, not only did the teachings of my parents, as I said, about tzedek, tzedek, tirshov, lead inevitably to the involvement in the two struggles. Not only is there a commonality between the two struggles, not only were other Jewish values of which they spoke reflected in both of those struggles. For example, I mentioned the power of solidarity in a just cause, but also the dangers of state-sanctioned incitement to hate, whether it be Soviet anti-Semitism or whether it be the racist apartheid philosophy itself. And as I mentioned, the political prisoners. So let me go fast forward now to 1981 and show you how, for me, the two causes intersected, not only in terms of all that which I mentioned, but how there became a direct relationship between the two. I arrived in 1981 in South Africa. My first visit to South Africa at the time, I have to say that it was one of the remarkable sort of psychological experiences. I remember going to shul in Johannesburg on my first Shabbat there, and being able to look at people in shul and knowing, as my wife Ariel was with me at the time, we knew their doubles back in Montreal. We would see somebody in the Kehillah and we'd say, that's, X or Y from Montreal. There was this remarkable psychological confluence. And as I said, there was this sense of being at home. And I was there in South Africa, I have to tell you, almost living a double life. I was there as the guest of the Jewish community, but I was also at the time the guest of the anti-apartheid community. And so I was dividing my time not only in a temporal sense, but even in terms of the involvement with the Jewish community, but also involvement in the struggle against apartheid. And with regard to that struggle against apartheid, those who hosted me on that first trip were very much those who were not only at the leadership of that struggle against apartheid, but at the forefront of the legal leadership. There was, in terms of the people that I met and with whom I then ended up working for years afterwards, there was Izzy Meisels. Izzy Meisels was a unique South African lawyer, unique amongst all the lawyers that I mentioned involved with Mandela. The reason I say that, because not only was he the legendary defender of Mandela in the first treason trial, from which Mandela and others were acquitted, but unlike a lot of the other Jews involved as lawyers for Mandela in the anti-apartheid movement, Izzy Meisels was deeply and profoundly identified as a Jew. And he headed up, for example, the South African Jewish leadership, whether it be the Zionist Federation and the like. So he was uniquely engaged in the struggle. Others with whom I met at the time were Jules Brody, who was then the head of the Lawyers for Human Rights, his wife, who was head really of the women's anti-apartheid movement, George Bizos, a Greek immigrant lawyer, became a close confidant and important person involved, in Arthur Chaskelson, who was then a junior lawyer on Mandela's team, headed up the Center for Legal Resources, which we in McGill University, where I was teaching in Canada, had a connection with them in South Africa, who later went on to become the first president of the first constitutional court in South Africa. So these were the people with whom I was meeting on that legal level as part of the anti-apartheid movement. And then I had what became to be a rather crucial encounter. I was asked by the South African Union of Jewish Students if I would speak to them on the topic of my choice. And the topic that came to mind, I had 2 years earlier been in the Soviet Union on behalf of Sharansky and other Asirei Tzion, prisoners of Zion. I actually had been arrested and expelled from the Soviet Union 2 years earlier. I was about to break into a smile because this happened in a number of places, such as my kids were beginning to wonder if their father was a lawyer or a criminal himself. But when I came there, as I say, to South Africa, I was asked by the South African Union of Jewish Students to give a talk, and the topic that we chose was, if Sharansky, why not Mandela? So you see right away the convergence of the two themes. Now, I was a bit concerned because, as I said to the students, Mandela is a banned person here in South Africa. The mere mention of his name can subject you even to a criminal offense. I have no problem. I'm here from Canada. Nothing will happen with me, but I'm concerned, about yourselves as students. And just as a testament to the South African Union of Jewish Students and to their own courage, which is part of what I want to convey this evening, they wanted me to speak on that topic. And I have to say, when I did speak of it, it was one of the largest crowds, I was told, that had ever assembled at Wits University, simply because of the nature of the topic, not certainly the speaker. And I gave the talk, and at the end of the talk, I was detained. And then one of the police officers said to me, "Do you know the foreign minister, Pick Botha?" And I said, "No, I don't." And he says, "Well, we've been asked to bring you to see him." And so I went to his office at that time in Pretoria, and I came in, and as I walked in and introduced him, and he looked up at a picture on the wall, and he said, "You know who that is, don't you?" And I said, "Yes, that's Anatoly Sharansky." Remember, I was telling you how these things converged. And he said, "Yes." He said, "I couldn't understand how somebody like yourself, who represents a great hero, Anatoly Sharansky, who represents a great hero against our common enemy, the communist Soviet Union, can speak at the same time about Nelson Mandela, who is also a communist and who's also, and that's why I wanted to meet you, and so that you can tell me how you can possibly speak about Sharansky and Mandela in the same breath." So I said to them that, that both Sharansky and Mandela are fighting for the same thing. They're both fighting for freedom. They're both fighting respectively for human rights in the Soviet Union, for human rights in South Africa. They're both fighting and are part of the three great struggles of the 20th century that Mandela, in fact, embodied so compellingly. The struggle for democracy, the struggle for equality, the struggle for freedom. As you saw, the long march to freedom. And so I spoke about this, and I have to tell you that Pik Botha then gave me a long lecture on why South African apartheid was really an exercise in democratic pluralism. That I didn't yet understand that this was really part of equality, separate but equal. And I would learn, more that this was really what South Africa was all about. And at the end of the talk, it went on for more than 3 hours, I have to say. And at the end of this, I said, I have to tell you, Mr. Botha, you may not like what I'm going to say. And you're right, the Soviet Union is a major human rights violator. But South Africa is the only post-World War II government that has institutionalized racism as a matter of law. Apartheid is not just a racist philosophy, it's a racist legal regime. And so for as long as it is necessary, and from wherever I will be, I will fight against this racist legal regime. Whereupon he looked at me and pointed to the portrait of Sharansky. He said, maybe I should have let them, detain you, or maybe I should have let them expel you, but because of, and he turned to Sharansky, because of Sharansky, he said, I will let you be. In fact, he said, you can go in and about South Africa for the next 10 days, 2 weeks, however long you're going to be here. See what you want, speak to whoever you want, and you tell me at the end of the day if what I told you was not correct. And so that's exactly what I did when I came back and I saw him. He said, so what did you say? Are we not an exercise in democracy? And I said, yes. And he got a big smile. He said, you see, I told you see how important it was for you to go about the country these past 10 days? I said, democracy if you're white. I said, if you're colored or if you're black, I said, it's even worse than I thought. Now fast forward to what took place close to 2 years ago. I was back in South Africa, and we were having a reunion of the lawyers that had been involved in Mandela's case. My own involvement was really a kind of a cameo shot. I had been asked early by Izzy Meisels, after that whole incident occurred, whether I would seek to do for Mandela what I was doing on behalf of Sharansky, which was making the case in the court of public opinion. Unlike Mandela, however, Sharansky had no lawyers. The Soviet Union would not permit any lawyers, and so in that case I had to get, and did get, a power of attorney at the time from his wife Avital and from his mother, which she courageously arranged to have smuggled out of the Soviet Union. But Mandela had a wonderful team of lawyers, as I mentioned, in South Africa. So I just had a modest role outside of South Africa to make the case, because in Canada, in 1985, for example, when we launched the anti-apartheid movement, the major civil society groups that were involved at the time, Amnesty International, the Canadian Labour Congress, and the Canadian Council of Churches and others, and I was invited to be a part of it, and they said to me, but don't bring up Mandela. And I said, this is the launching of the anti-apartheid struggle. I said, what do you mean, don't bring, well, Mandela is a terrorist. In other words, he was still defined as a terrorist under Canadian law at the time. And so we had to make the case and cause on behalf of Mandela. So now comes to the question of Pik Botha. When we had this reunion at the home of Jules and Selma Brody with, I mentioned the Arthur Chaskell, and such as all, close to 2 years ago. Regrettably, Arthur Chaskell died sometime after me. They then asked me if I had seen Pik Botha since the time of this encounter that took place in 19. I said no. They said, well, why don't you, get in touch with him? Which I did, and it was a remarkable conversation. Pik Botha told me that he never forgot that encounter, because he could never forget how somebody spoke to him in such, as he put it, almost a brutish way about the whole question of the struggle against apartheid. But he said that he had been following everything that I had been doing since then. And he wanted me to know a number of things. Number one, that he, Pik Botha, had become the first minister in the South African government to call for the release of Nelson Mandela. 2, that he had become a member of the African National Congress. And 3, that he ended up being a minister in Nelson Mandela's government. Now, I think this is in some sense also yet another testament to Mandela's power, as he did both with prison wardens or as he did with ministers in the apartheid government, to really transform adversaries into allies. And that was really a very, I think, important and compelling part of his legacy. And now we move to the last part, and then I'll go to Iran. And that is the visit that I made as part of the Canadian Prime Minister's delegation to South Africa a month ago, to be there for the remembrance and the celebration of Nelson Mandela's life. I have to tell you, it was a very moving and memorable trip. I recalled when we were going to the stadium for the memorial service, the signposts on the way to the stadium, you had signs that said, Nelson Mandela, global icon. Nelson Mandela, father of the nation. And in fact, you know, the South Africans were paying tribute to Nelson Mandela not only as the father of the nation, not only as someone who embodied, you know, the 3 great struggles of the 20th century, as I said, the struggle for democracy, the struggle for equality, the struggle for freedom, but whose legacy resonated internationally. And I have to tell you that that also took place with regard to Canada. Mandela paid his first visit almost to a foreign country after release from prison in 1990 to Canada, where he came to pay tribute to the political leadership at the time that had been so instrumental in embarking upon the struggle against apartheid, sanctions, and the like. And part of our delegation at this time consisted of the former Prime Minister Brian Mulroney from the Progressive Conservative government, Jean Chrétien, who had been so much involved in that struggle against apartheid. And then Nelson Mandela came. I didn't meet him then in 1990 on his first visit, but I did meet him in 1998. Mace, you mentioned about the Order of Canada. Nelson Mandela became the first non-Canadian to be admitted to the Order of Canada. And as I was a member of the Order of Canada at the time, that presented an opportunity, and we met then for the first time. And then in 2001, Nelson Mandela was made an honorary citizen of Canada, the second honorary citizen at the time. Our first honorary citizen was Raoul Wallenberg, and Mandela became our second honorary citizen. And then I had occasion to meet him again at that time. And in both those visits, he made some statements which I think reflected the powerful impact that he had, and the importance. Really, I remember him saying when he was in Canada that if he would have come out of prison still bearing hate, he would have really still been a prisoner. And that therefore he had to no longer be a prisoner of hate, but really be a person to bring together a rainbow nation. It's interesting, and my daughter McCall may recall that when I was first elected to the Canadian Parliament in 1999, I used the metaphor of a rainbow riding to reflect the nature of the riding that I represent, which is very much a very multicultural riding. But what the people in my riding may not have known at the time when I characterized it as a rainbow riding was yet another inspiration, you know, that I was taking from Nelson Mandela. But perhaps the most compelling exchange I had, and with this I'll close the visit in South Africa, was when Mandela was lying in state. You know, it was very different. When we went to the memorial or celebration in the stadium, I mean, this was more of a celebration than of mourning. Celebration of his great life and legacy. The next day, when we were visiting, Mandela lying in state, the mood was entirely different. It was very quiet. It was very somber. It really was a kind of, almost, if you saw the people lined up to see Mandela, or it already seemed like a kind of a valley of tears. And I saw and started to speak with a young woman. And I don't know what prompted me, but I just asked her what Nelson Mandela meant to her. And she said to me two rather profound things. She said, and she was about, I think, 18, 19, and she said, you know, because of Nelson Mandela, I have to live every day in such a way that I could make it a better day for somebody else. The first thing. The second thing she said, you know, I'm a free person. I grew up after apartheid. She said, I never lived under apartheid. Because of Nelson Mandela, I'm a free person, and I'm free to be whoever it is that I can try and be. She said, but I can only be that which I'd like to be if I remain true to his legacy. If I live my life as he would have liked me to live it. And you know, she was echoing a lot of the sentiments that I heard from young people when I was there. Now, I don't want to be in the person of somebody, you know, who visits China for 3 days and then writes a book, China Yesterday, Today, and Tomorrow. I'm trying to locate this in the context and in the background of my ongoing visits and encounters with South Africa, and I was very much touched, as I say, by what the young people were saying and giving expression to their feelings. Now let me turn to Iran at this point. And you know, it's not disconnected from everything that I've said. When I spoke about the teachings of my parents, you know, that tzedek, tirdof, of just shall you pursue, was not just in the abstract. With it were a whole series of values that were over the years conveyed to me. For example, the importance of zachor, the fact that forgetfulness is exile and remembrance is redemption. When Maish reminded me about Wansi, I mean, what was Wansi and why was that, you know, so critical? Because not only was this really at the time of the framing of the final solution, but the worst thing was really the indifference and inaction at the time of the international community as bystander. And so, if you want to look at some of the lessons of Zachor that relate even with regard to Iran, one of them would be the danger of state-sanctioned incitement to hate and genocide. In other words, the enduring lesson of the Shoah, we talk in terms of Zachor, and in fact of the genocides that followed in former Yugoslavia and Rwanda and Darfur, is that these genocides occurred not simply because of the machinery of death, but because of state-sanctioned cultures of hate. It was this teaching of contempt, this demonizing of the other, this is where it all begins. And I think in terms of Iran, one of the compelling dangers has been this state-sanctioned incitement to hate and genocide. And another related value and commitment that went with tzedek tirdof was the dangers of indifference and inaction in the face of such incitement or in the face of atrocity crimes, and therefore taking us all the way back to lo tamod al dam re'acha, you know, thou shalt not stand idly by while thy brothers and sisters' blood is being shed. And when Maish mentioned to me once, the international community stood idly by. And so it was the combination of both the state-sanctioned cultures of hate and then atrocity on the one hand, and the indifference and inaction by the bystander international community that brought together and brought us into the situation that we found ourselves with regard to, if you will, Nazi Germany and Lahavdil. I don't want to make any comparison, but that brought us into situations in the struggle for Soviet Jewry and the struggle against apartheid. Both of them had a commonality in state-sanctioned cultures of hate and indifference and inaction and the like. It was the breaking of that indifference and inaction in both cases, and the power of solidarity in a just cause that had such a transformative impact. Now, when one looks at Iran, you have the situation today where Khamenei's Iran, and I use that term to distinguish it from the people and publics in Iran who are otherwise the targets of mass domestic repression. I used to say at that time Ahmadinejad's Iran, but let's face it, Ahmadinejad was under the leadership of Khamenei, who's still there. That Khamenei's Iran has been for some time and constituted for some time a threat to international peace and security, to regional and Middle East stability, to Israel and the Jewish people, and increasingly and alarmingly so, to its own citizens, to the Iranian people themselves. What we're seeing today in Khamenei's Iran is the toxic convergence of four distinct yet interrelated threats: the nuclear threat, the incitement threat, the terrorist threat, and the massive domestic repression. Let there be no mistake about it. As we meet, even after the recent Geneva Agreement, and certainly before, but as we meet, Iran is in standing violation of international legal prohibitions against uranium enrichment and related violations of the UN Security Council resolutions, the non-nuclear proliferation treatment, and the nuclear non-proliferation treatment, and that's the first. Second, Iran continues to be engaged in state-sanctioned cultures of hate. Because we don't have Ahmadinejad around anymore, and since Ahmadinejad was almost obsessively engaged with this kind of propagation of hate, people don't realize that this propagation of hate, both during Ahmadinejad's time and since Ahmadinejad, is pervasive throughout the Iranian leadership. I have here with me a booklet that has just come out called Sworn to Destruction: What Iranian Leaders Continue to Say About Israel in the Rouhani Era. In other words, the replacement of Ahmadinejad by Rouhani and his charm offensive should not mask that the state-sanctioned cultures of hate continue unabated. So we have that. The third thing is, Iran continues to be the leading state sponsor of international terrorism. In the last 2 years alone, there have been numerous terrorist attacks on 5 continents that have been themselves planned and organized and financed, etc., by Iran. In fact, this coming summer will be the 20th anniversary of the terrorist bombing in Argentina, the bombing of the Jewish Community Center, the AMIA, in Argentina. And as the Minister of Justice of Argentina said to me when I met with him years ago, he said, this was the greatest post-World War II terrorist atrocity in Argentina. And I should tell you that in the last election, in Iran, when only 8 people out of more than 700 candidates were permitted to run, and those who represented a loyalty to Khamenei, 2 of the people of the 8 who were permitted to run were 2 of those who had been indicted by the Argentinian judiciary for the terrorist bombing of the AMIA Jewish Community Center. So you see this culture of impunity with regard to Iran. So that's on the third threat, the terrorist threat. And the fourth is with regard to the massive domestic repression, widespread and systematic violations of human rights that really reach the level of what might be called from an international legal perspective, crimes against humanity. Now I'm going to close my remarks by focusing on these human rights violations in Iran. Because, I found, for example, when I go to the campuses in the United States and Canada and elsewhere, if you speak to them about the nuclear threat, the instinct of younger people today is, to be for peace and the like, and you talk about the nuclear threat, it's not always something that they're responsive to hear about. But if you tell them Because in the campus culture, human rights is a very important idiom. If you tell them that Iran is engaged in a massive domestic repression of human rights, and after you go through that massive domestic repression, and then you put to them the question, do you want a country that is engaged in such systematic domestic repression to have a nuclear weapon or to become a nuclear power to further leverage that domestic repression? Then they say, oh, no, no, no. Then they understand why being a nuclear power is such a threat. And for example, a country that is so criminally engaged in what is happening in Syria, here too, in organizing and arming and financing the horrific repression that is being undertaken in Syria, crimes against humanity there. Think again, the kind of leveraging of what a nuclear Iran might be. So I'm going to just speak now about the human rights, and I've written elsewhere, and I'm not going to burden you with going into all the human rights violations, but just to give you some examples of things that are not being addressed or not talked about, but must be kept in mind. You know, when the United States negotiated an arms control agreement in the 80s with the former Soviet Union, they did not say, okay, we're going to go ahead and negotiate an arms control agreement, but we're not going to talk about human rights in the Soviet Union. We're not going to talk about the Sharanskys. We're not going to talk about political prisoners. On the contrary, what was so notable, for example, about the Helsinki Final Act is it connected three baskets at the time. It connected the military, the security basket, the economic basket, and the human rights basket. In other words, the US and the international powers at the time were not prepared to negotiate an arms control agreement with the Soviet Union on the backs of those who were struggling for human rights in the Soviet Union. They were not prepared to mask or marginalize or sanitize the human rights violations. Regrettably, the recent Geneva Agreement focused only on the nuclear, did not address neither the terrorist threat, nor the incitement threat, nor the human rights threat. Let me just, as I say, close with some of those human rights indicators. The first is, prior to Rouhani becoming president, the person who has become emblematic of the Iranian charm offensive, prior to him becoming president in place of Ahmadinejad, Iran had the highest per capita rate of executions of any country in the world. Now, to those who follow human rights, this is reasonably well known. But what even those who follow human rights do not know, or not yet protesting, is that since Rouhani came to power, the rate of executions in Iran has actually intensified. So not only is it still the leading executioner of its own people per capita of any country in the world, but it has, in terms of the number of people being executed, over 300 have been executed since Rouhani assumed power himself. So this is an astonishing but yet very disturbing data. In the week that Rouhani visited the United Nations and the General Assembly, of which it was spoken as being the sort of apex of the Iranian charm offensive, in that week alone, 30 people were executed. And I looked in the New York Times and the Washington Post and elsewhere to see if there's any discussion about the rate of executions. None. Second thing, torture. The special rapporteur for human rights in Iran, who was not permitted to go to Iran, but has met with former victims of torture and the like, reported, and I've met with him, that there is widespread torture in Iran, particularly torture of political prisoners, particularly torture of detainees in order to secure confessions, and widespread torture. In fact, he's talked about the fact that amongst prisoners, there is in certain instances, in certain serious torture, 100% torture of political detainees, political prisoners, and the like. So you hear about Rouhani having released 80 political prisoners prior to coming to the UN General Assembly. And yes, certainly for the families of those victims and others, and I represented one of the political prisoners released, a woman, Nasreen Sotoudeh, a kind of iconic lawyer in Iran who had worked on behalf of other women, other political prisoners, other lawyers, until she herself became a political prisoner, and she was released, and there was a lot of coverage of her release, but nobody spoke about the fact that there were still some 2,500 political prisoners in Iran, cutting across all parts of Iranian society. Journalists, artists, educators, political leaders, religious leaders, ethnic leaders, and the like. So, second thing is political prisoners still being arrested, imprisoned, tortured, and the like. So you've got executions, you've got torture, you've got political prisoners. The fourth thing is the assault on religious and ethnic minorities. You can take Kurds as an example, and as I'm speaking to you, a whole group of Kurds are an imminent threat of execution. And then perhaps the group that is the largest religious minority in Iran, and the one most subjected to being targeted, and that is the Baha'i. Now here in Israel, of course, there is the center of the Baha'i near Haifa. But what people may not realize is that while Rouhani spoke about religious freedom, Khamenei issued a fatwa against the Baha'i. So you hear about the charm offensive, but you don't hear about other things that are occurring in exact opposition to the charm offensive. As we meet now, the entire Baha'i leadership is in prison. The entire educational leadership is in prison. There's an ongoing state-sanctioned incitement to hate against the Baha'i. So here too is yet another indicator of this set of human rights violations. There is as well persistent and pervasive assaults on the rights of women. There are more journalists that have been imprisoned in Iran than in any other country. And while you hear about Rouhani and others in the Iranian leadership using Twitter and the other exemplifications of the social media, they are using it. If others amongst the dissident or human rights community try to use it, they end up being arrested or imprisoned for their use of the social media that is otherwise extolled by Rouhani and the like. And I can go on, but I will close with one final and most disturbing example of human rights violations. And this is what was conveyed to me when I was in Paris 2 months ago to meet with the families of Iranian political prisoners and the like. And what they said to me was the most disturbing thing was not only the silence of the international community. Remember, we were talking about indifference in Iran. Not only the silence of the international community while the people in Iran, educational people, religious, are being arrested, imprisoned, tortured, and the like. But that Rouhani, and you've probably not read about this, that Rouhani appointed as his Minister of Justice a man by the name of Mustafa Pur Hamamadi, the person who was responsible for the mass murder in the 1988, mass murder 5,000 Iranian dissidents. Rather than him being held to account for his involvement in the mass murder of Iranian dissidents, of his fellow Iranians, he has now been appointed Minister of Justice in Iran. And what the families were telling to me so painfully is that as bad as the silence of the international community is with regard to the mass murder that are taking place in Iran, that took place then, and for which there's been no respite, but that the mass murderer himself was appointed Minister of Justice 25 years later. And again, this thing goes without notice or reference in the international media or in the political leadership. I would have wished that in the negotiations of the P5+1 with the Iranian leadership on the nuclear issue, somebody would have brought up the fact that Iran had appointed as its Minister of Justice this Pur Hamamadi, or that they had appointed as the Minister of Defense the person who was implicated in being involved with Hezbollah with regard to the bombing of the Amia Community Center and the like. And so these are things that regrettably are being in the shadows, but which must be brought to account. And so the question is, what then can we do? And I don't want to turn this into another large discussion other than just one-liners in terms of what I think we need to do with regard to Iran. And in order to sum it all up, draw upon the South African and Soviet Jewry effective success in terms of solidarity and a just cause. The first thing is we have to focus on the critical mass of Iranian threat. Not just the nuclear, the incitement, the terrorists, and the massive domestic repression. Number one. Number two, we have to not only focus on it, but we have to seek to do something about it. Just some initiatives that we have in Canada. We now have an annual Iran Accountability Week. So for that week, we focus entirely in Parliament on the Iranian fourfold threat. Not on one threat, but on a fourfold threat. We hold parliamentary hearings concurrent with that Iran Accountability Week. We hold public forums in the evening concurrent with it. And we have launched as well what is called the Iranian Political Prisoner Global Advocacy Project, where Canadian members of Parliament, along with our counterpart Americans, have been invited to adopt a prisoner of conscience. You know where that comes from? The Soviet Jewry movement, where we adopted prisoners of conscience to put a face on the otherwise anonymous political prisoners. So while we know about the Sharanskys of the Soviet Union, know about the Mandelas of South Africa, we don't know about the political prisoners in Iran, and we want to put a face and an identity on those being imprisoned and tortured. Number three, we've developed an inter-parliamentary group for human rights in Iran that will focus expressly and specifically on human rights. Number four, we're trying to counsel as to the dangers of state-sanctioned cultures of hate, drawing upon what happened in the Soviet Union in terms of state anti-Semitism, South African apartheid, that racism, but also back and in particular to the Second World War and the Holocaust, the dangers of state-sanctioned cultures of hate. And we draw upon Mandela's legacy, where he said, if I would still hate, I'd be a prisoner. And in fact, I know that there's been discussions as to whether, Mandela was really a friend of the Jews. How could he be a friend of the Jews if he also embraced Arafat and Gaddafi? And I know there may be some amongst you who were prone, understandably, to ask that question. And it's a question that one should not duck, and it's a question that needs to be asked. Let me just tell you from our own conversations and otherwise with regard to Mandela on that point. He said, Israel was involved with and supported the South African government at the time that I was in prison. And he said, I don't hold it against Israel. He said Israel was isolated in the international arena. And so she had to look to find the friends wherever she could find them. And Israel wasn't more involved with South Africa than were the Arab countries, he said, who were involved, and more, or even European countries and the like. He said, but if for a moment, if you can look at it in terms of myself, I also was isolated at the time. And so those who stood with me at the time were the Arafat or Gaddafi. I'm not saying that you should support that. I'm only saying that just as you might understand why Israel was involved with South Africa, for which I hold no grudge against them for that, then you might understand why I stood with those who stood with me, because I remained loyal to those who were friendly to me in my isolation. I'm not justifying Mandela here. I'm just sharing with you some of his views on that. And what I think we need to do is to, rather than focus on those things about Mandela, which here in the South African Jewish community, you know best, and those things that might concern us about Mandela and his legacy that you know best, that might not concern the rest of the international community, namely his association with Arafat and Gaddafi. I think it's important also that we focus on those things in Mandela's legacy that can be important, not only for the international community, but for us and our case and cause. It may not be all that well known that Mandela saw in Menachem Begin and the Irgun the model for the African national liberation movement. This is something that is not, if you're going to talk about Gaddafi and Arafat, then let's look at the other side of the ledger and use that as well in support of our case and cause. That he saw in Zionism and spoke of it as being a national liberation movement. That he said, so long as the Arabs, and I'm quoting from him directly, and this was something that he said when he visited to Canada, but not only in Canada, that so long as the Arabs do not recognize Israel, Israel cannot be expected to withdraw from the occupied territories. So I'm saying that you can almost develop a Mandela advocacy format on behalf of the Israeli case and cause, rather than have a situation where as if it were, the Mandela format should be used just against us as being identified with Arafat, and thereby giving credence to